Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and I'll be reading to you part 2 from a memo I was asked to write in June. I completed this June 28th, 2023. This is part 2 called Hearing the Varied Voices of Zionism, and I was asked to write a memo about the consequences of apartheid in Israel, the systematic discrimination against the Palestinian people, which has existed for decades. So these are consequences 7 through 12 that I'll be reading. And to review, here's the map of Israel. The occupied territories are in purple that Israel took over in the war of 1967. It took the Golan Heights from Syria. This is the West Bank. It's called the West Bank because the Jordan River is right here. So it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's where homes are being demolished of Palestinians well before the October attack. And this is the Gaza Strip where the war is occurring now, and where 2.3 million Palestinians have been blockaded for 16 years. So how this attack by Hamas onto Israel can be considered unprovoked is bewildering, because it's very much provoked. Here is consequence number 7. This is a consequence of apartheid in Israel and of supporting this apartheid. A consequence is the trampling of the variety of voices within Zionism and catering to a revisionist strain of Zionists who admired Hitler. This is a particularly important further development of points 3 and 6 that I mentioned in the first essay, where I talk about the importance of looking at the multiple fronts of conflict, not just the main conflict between Israel and Palestinians, but the conflicts amongst Israelis, conflicts amongst Palestinians. That's important to look at, because if people on either side think, oh, as soon as we wipe out the Palestinians we'll be happy, or as soon as we get Israel out of here we'll be home free, that's not true, because there's all these other conflicts within the groups. So the idea is we want to have positive, constructive, non-violent means of addressing each front of conflict, including the main one. So here I'm going to talk about fronts of conflict within Zionism and variations of opinion within Zionism. In the early 1900s, Zionism, which was the movement to create a homeland for Jews in Palestine, because other homelands around the world were considered also. Zionism was primarily a European movement centered in Berlin. And the vast majority of American Jews were anti-Zionist, viewing the idea as anachronistic and dangerous. Reform Jews opposed Zionism and feared that the creation of a Jewish state would increase anti-Semitism. Ultra-Orthodox Jews opposed Zionism because it was such a secular idea, focusing on nationalism rather than religious devotion. Socialist Jews opposed Zionism because they identified with the international working class rather than a certain ethnic group. Jews in the U.S. government also depicted Zionism and its Eastern European origins in unfavorable terms, perhaps with prejudice against Eastern Europe and Russia. Significantly, Jews already living in the Mideast in the 1940s were anti-Zionist. They opposed creating a Jewish state in Israel because they did not want to risk ruining current peaceful relations between Jews and Muslims. Anti-Zionist Jews objected that, quote, pushing Christians and Muslims out of Palestine would be grounds for increased anti-Semitism around the world, end quote. Even within the United States, some Jewish leaders argued that it would be, quote, undemocratic to impose the will of Jewish outsiders on Palestinian Arabs, end quote. These democratic sentiments deserved attention, but instead they seem to be overrun by foreign powers' strategic goals and by certain Christians' passions, including the restorationist fervor of certain American Protestant Christians who believed in a type of magic formula that had been in circulation at least since the 1600s. The formula? Once Jews resettle the Holy Land, Christ will descend upon earth a second time, and evidently everything will be just great then for Christians. They'll be able to quit their jobs, live in peace, and float around as happy spirits, never bored, tired, angry, or depressed. The fate of Jews in this story seemed to be muffled up. But in addition to the differences that existed between pro- and anti-Zionists, even amongst Zionists, major differences of opinion existed in the period between the 1917 Balfour Declaration and the 1948 establishment of Israel regarding their anticipated political and social relations with the Palestinian people. So precisely over how they would relate to the Palestinians, Zionists disagreed. Some, such as Judah Leib Magnus, head of the American Zionist Federation and a follower of Gandhi, were binational Zionists who believed in the necessity of creating a binational state in which Arabs and Jews would have equal status and opportunity. Henrietta Szold, as well, that's S-Z-O-L-D, was an enthusiastic Zionist who believed that Arabs in Palestine had a legitimate demand for independence. She worked for reconciliation between Zionists and Arab nationalists and even campaigned for compulsory Arabic education in Jewish schools. Quote, "I have always held that Arab-Jewish relationships should have been the central point of our Zionist thinking." End quote. Where have these voices gone? Why have they been forgotten? Of great relevance to today, a severe conflict existed amongst non-revisionist and revisionist Zionists. David Ben-Gurion was a socialist who eventually became Israel's first prime minister in 1948. He and Vladimir Zeev Jabotinsky worked together in the Zionist movement following World War I. Jabotinsky, however, grew apart from Ben-Gurion's Zionism and founded a splinter movement, a revisionist opposition to the mainstream Zionist movement. Jabotinsky, ignoring the inhumane, unjust crowding and displacement effects of Israeli immigration on the Arab population in Palestine, called for massive Jewish immigration to Palestine, 50,000 immigrants per year. Revisionists also had expansive territorial goals, with Jabotinsky claiming that the Jordan River should run through the center of Palestine, the Jewish homeland, not merely along its eastern border. So he wanted what's Israel to extend this way. Jabotinsky is sometimes referred to as the father of Jewish terrorism, but he and his fellow uncompromising revisionists consider themselves to be the true Zionists. Yossi Melman remarks, quote, "Jabotinsky adored Italian fascism and its leader Benito Mussolini. Revisionism established a brand of harsh, merciless Zionism without sentiment or compromise. It is this ruthless form of Zionism that was expressed by the words and deeds of Menachem Begin and later by Yitzhak Shamir. Members of Jabotinsky's revisionist movement attempted in the 1930s to emulate the political style and culture of the European right. As liberalism and democracy in their eyes were weak, they opted for being Jewish fascists. Like their role models, the people in Jabotinsky's movement wore brown shirts, organized parades and demonstrations, and worshipped their leader. Some even argued that, had Hitler not been anti-Semitic, they would have supported National Socialism." You know, so much for this silly argument we see all the time when Putin has talked about the neo-Nazism in Ukraine. And the U.S. media and professors keep saying, that's impossible. Ukraine's President Zelensky is Jewish. It's impossible for neo-Nazis to be in Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying Zelensky's a Jewish fascist, but this example shows that these Jewish fascists were in alignment with the ideas of Nazism, of the ethnocentrism, and the belief in using violence. So here we can see how Jabotinsky's revisionism, and I'll add, because the Nazi ideology isn't just about anti-Semitism. It's something bigger than that. It's a way of relating to human beings. Therefore, when people say Zelensky's Jewish, there can't be neo-Nazism, that's an ignorant statement. So here we can see how Jabotinsky's revisionism, which was upheld by Shamir, Begin, and Netanyahu, turned Judaism on its head and slanted Zionism to its most negative extreme. You know, why couldn't we have had Henrietta Zold, the binational Zionist, in greater power? What began as a humane desire to help Jews, particularly after Hitler's Holocaust, by creating Israel, turned into the creation of a state deeply influenced and at times led by Jewish revisionists themselves, adherents of the ideology of Jabotinsky, who admired Hitler. Revisionists believe in militancy, narrow-mindedness, and ethnic superiority. And they hold cooperation and democracy in disdain. And that's like the Nazi ideology. Perhaps this disdain for what is, quote, weak, developed from years of terror and despair as a persecuted people. It's certainly understandable if it did. But, to my knowledge, these are not fundamental values or principles of Judaism, nor are they fundamental values or principles of the United States. And they're certainly not principles to encourage or upon which to build a state, especially a state that is being created by victims of a Nazi regime whose enshrinement of these very principles led to millions of deaths and the mass immigration of these victims and their descendants. So why keep those principles and values and patterns of human relations alive? Unfortunately, these principles took power. In the 1930s and 1940s, Britain tried to contain this virulent strain within Zionism. Various British commissions, having studied the severe violence in Palestine between Jews and Arabs, had made several suggestions for changes in British policy to reduce the despair and frustration of Palestinian Arabs. All of the commissions had insisted, the British commissions insisted, that Arab land must be protected and Jewish immigration must be limited in order to avoid worsening the problem. And I'll mention, it's interesting, Al Jazeera has a very good summary of the current conflict. October 9th, what's the Israel-Palestine conflict about? A simple guide. But there's a weakness in this guide, is that it doesn't show a thing in the past about how the British were trying to protect the Arabs. The way this is written, the British were just part of the bad white man. But actually Britain was caught in the middle. It was the white man caught in the middle between the Jews and the Arabs. And actually, the British took a stance, and they were trying to help the Arabs. So I think that's an important point. However, because of succumbing to intense Zionist pressure upon the British government, it was not until the White Paper of 1939 that Britain declared unequivocally that it did not support Palestine's becoming a Zionist state. Yes, it had supported a homeland in the Balfour Declaration, but not necessarily a political state. Furthermore, with the White Paper, again, which Al Jazeera doesn't mention in this article, Britain set limits, 15,000 per year, of Jewish immigrants to Palestine for the next 5 years, after which immigration should cease altogether unless the Arab community approved further immigration. Britain also restricted land transfers to Jews to certain areas, because land transfers is how a lot of the Palestinian Arabs lost their land. And much of this information that I'm reading about is from William Cleveland's book, History of the Middle East. The White Paper was a shock to Zionists, or at least to those Zionists who weren't binational Zionists. And Britain became enemy number one to the revisionists who preferred Hitler. While the mainstream Zionist plan was to wait until after World War II to fight the British and sabotage the White Paper policy, two dissident Jewish military units began attacking Britain even during World War II. The first was the Irgun, a terrorist organization that was the military arm of the revisionists. The second was the Stern Gang. In other words, while Britain was engaged in battling Hitler, the mass murderer of Jews, Britain was being attacked by Jewish extremists. Why? Because Britain was trying to support both parts of the Balfour Declaration. The part that created a homeland for Jews, and the part that emphasized that this homeland creation must not harm anybody already living there. And it's interesting, again, Al Jazeera doesn't mention the two parts of the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's, and here's a quote, this is the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. End quote. That's the full Balfour Declaration. Because of this fair-mindedness, the British were being attacked by Jewish extremists who have likely been overrepresented in Israel's government for decades and who are currently in command. What's equally interesting about these two Jewish terrorist organizations that were attacking Britain during World War II is the direct involvement in them of two future Israeli prime ministers. Menachem Begin, who was prime minister from 1977 to 1983, led the Irgun beginning in 1943. He led it. And Yitzhak Shamir, who was prime minister twice from 1983 to 84 and from 1986 to 92, who had emigrated from Poland to Palestine in 1935, joined Jabotinsky's Irgun in 1936, quote, where he personally participated in attacks resulting in the deaths of dozens of Arabs, end quote. Because this is in 1936, before Israel was even created in 1948. I mean, the militant Jewish groups in Palestine were horrendous to the Arabs. But again, it shows the differences between the types of Zionists that were there. Not all Zionists were like that. Later, Shamir came under the... So they were both prime ministers were in... Before they were prime minister, were in the Irgun. You know, killing Arabs and British. But then later, Shamir came under the influence of Avraham Stern, who's getting split from Jabotinsky because the Stern gang wanted to be more militant and harsh. Jabotinsky was too soft on the British. The Stern gang felt Britain was more of a threat than Nazi Germany. Quote, indeed, they dreamed of forging an alliance with Mussolini and Hitler, end quote. This is from Yossi Melman, The New Israelis. Melman refers to Stern's, quote, blind stupidity. It was the understanding of Stern that Hitler did not intend to destroy the Jews, but simply wanted to get rid of them, end quote. The British shot and killed Stern in 1942 and detained Shamir. Shamir and a comrade escaped, but the comrade's passions were even more extreme. He wanted to kill Ben-Gurion himself. Such a desire crossed even Shamir's line into insanity. And so, under Shamir's orders, the comrade was killed, and Shamir became the new leader of the gang. At least, the Stern gang harbored fears of traitors and reacted cruelly. Quote from Memo, under Shamir, the Stern gang was small and highly secretive. Their unmitigated cruelty, however, terrified the British. They robbed banks, executed Jewish traitors, and assassinated a British cabinet minister and other British officials and diplomats. But they even executed, in quote, Jewish traitors. It's what happens in countries like in Rwanda, where the moderates are killed by extremists. They also murdered hundreds of Arabs in indiscriminate terror attacks by planting car bombs and booby traps in Arab markets and public places. End quote. Remember, 2 of Israel's prime ministers were in these gangs. The British arrested Shamir in 1946 and deported him to a remote detainee camp in Africa. But once again, he escaped. Once Israel became a nation in 1948, Shamir returned and was evidently found to possess a suitable personality for the Secret Service, the Mossad, where he worked until 1965. Of interest, it was during the time of Shamir's work in the Mossad in 1963 that U.S. President John F. Kennedy grew furious with Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion for secretly developing nuclear weapons. They have, I think about 80 now, undeclared covert nuclear weapons. Kennedy was convinced that Israel wasn't developing nuclear power simply for peaceful purposes, and he was enraged with Israel's President Ben-Gurion for refusing to allow U.S. inspections of the Israeli reactor in Dimona. Ben-Gurion explained that if Israel didn't have nukes, Egypt's President Nasser would do to Israel what Hitler had done. That's what he said. To try to alleviate his fears, Kennedy offered to provide him with Hawk ground-to-air missiles. But Ben-Gurion responded by deploying the Hawks around Dimona, where the Israeli reactor was, where the Israeli nukes were located, and by continuing to block U.S. inspections. In the summer of 1963, just months before his November assassination, Kennedy warned Ben-Gurion that his stubbornness would seriously jeopardize relations with the United States. With this history of Israel's leaders, and with Netanyahu's similar embrace of revisionism, the U.S. government has got to recognize that Israel's government is not representative of Israel's people, nor is it representative of Judaism or of any principles for which the U.S. government supposedly stands. In fact, it supports principles of brutality, inhumanity, and ethnocentrism that were central to the Holocaust, and that were central reasons why some felt Jews needed a homeland to be safe. With the nation, and let's put that in quotes, with the nation of Israel based now for decades upon the very principles under which Jews have suffered for centuries, the very principles against which the nation of Israel supposedly stood, it is a mistake to support the Israeli government as it currently behaves. And maybe the nation of Israel actually never did stand against those principles. To be clear, it would also be a mistake. It would be a mistake to support the Israeli government. But it would also be a mistake to seek to harm it or destroy it. But in its current incarnation, it must not be financially or politically supported. Consequence number 8 of apartheid in Israel and supporting it. Failing to give Netanyahu the pressure he needs to say no to Jewish extremists. In order to maintain support from his extremist coalition government, Netanyahu apparently feels pressured to please the Jewish extremists who are extremely harsh towards Palestinians and who favor annexation of Palestinian land. I mean, I think of Netanyahu as extremist. So these are even extremer extremists than Netanyahu in his government. Netanyahu's, quote, traditional inclination toward military caution runs in stark contrast to his extremist coalition partner Itamar Ben-Gvir, who espouses a heavy hand against the Palestinians, end quote. If the U.S. government were to support these harsh Israeli policies, such support would not only be condoning crimes against humanity and potential war crimes, but it may even be contrary to the will of the majority of Israelis. Such support would amount to supporting Jewish extremists who are not representative of the majority of Israelis. It's the same with Ukraine. Supporting Ukraine's government, that's not supporting the Ukrainian people. However, if the U.S. government were to condemn such harsh treatment, evictions and annexation plans of Palestinian land, if the U.S. government were to put some teeth behind its words by cutting off funds to Israel's government, upon which Israel depends, until the Israeli government's behavior changed dramatically in accord with international law, then such pressure would actually help Netanyahu not feel pressured to support the Jewish extremists. Whether he wants such help or not is not apparent, but it would make it easier for him to say to the Jewish extremists that he cannot do what they wish because Israel's major source of funding will be cut off if he obliges them in their apartheid schemes and dreams. Netanyahu himself pledged in November 2020 that he would lead a government that would, quote, avoid unnecessary adventures and expand the circle of peace, end quote. You know, Zelensky also campaigned on a platform of peace. I'm not saying that the two men were liars. Pressures might have been put on them. And then the U.S. is supporting those pressures. Or maybe the U.S. is doing the pressures itself. I mean, maybe the U.S. is the initial one giving the pressures, because it's certainly part of that pressure that's anti-peace. The U.S. government can help him do that, to expand the circle of peace, by applying financial and other forms of pressure, as well as positive instruction and requests, so that he can stand up to Jewish extremists without taking the blame for disappointing them himself. Consequence number 9. Failing to use pressure from other Muslim nations to enable Netanyahu to stand up to Jewish extremists of his coalition. The same argument as in point 8 holds true here for pressure applied to Netanyahu from surrounding Muslim nations, many of whom are alarmed by Israel's behavior. Netanyahu wants to be able to give as much freedom to his extremist coalition partners as he can without offending Muslim allies. His Jewish extremist coalition partners, quote, will be looking for opportunities to tell Netanyahu that his concerns about meaningful backlash to their agenda are overblown. Like they'll be wanting to say, oh, you don't have to worry about the Muslim nations around us. Don't worry about that. So if the Muslim allies were to put more pressure on Netanyahu and publicly threaten Israel with this or that if they continue to behave harshly and inhumanely towards Palestinians, he would be able to better stand up to his Jewish extremist coalition partners and convince them that his fears about Muslim backlash are not overblown. Of course, the backlash that is threatened should not be violent. Backlash could be financial, economic, and political. And also, if the Muslim nations, two points, if the Muslim nations put more pressure on Netanyahu threatening to do this or that, it could lead to war if the United States government is still supporting the U.S., is still supporting the Israeli government. And another problem is, if Muslim nations get overly threatening, like threatening war, some Jewish extremists believe that holy war with the Muslims is necessary to bring about final judgment day. So they actually want this war. they think the war will bring the end of the world and then peace. Well, it will bring the end of the world, but I don't think any divine powers will be too pleased with the people who did that. And I don't think it would bring peace, it'll just bring death. But we have to be aware that certain extremists actually want war because they think it will bring heaven on earth. It's going to bring hell on earth. Consequence number 10. Supporting Jewish extremists in order to give Netanyahu the deal he wants in his corruption trial. That's another consequence. Be aware that Netanyahu may need the support of Jewish extremists in order to help him get through unscathed his corruption trial, which began in 2018. Quote, Netanyahu feels beholden to these forces for his political and legal survival, hoping his coalition partners will agree to legislation that will effectively vacate his ongoing corruption trial. So to some extent, he may be killing thousands of Palestinians so that he can get through a trial. Therefore, if the U.S. government were to support these extremist, harsh Israeli policies that amount to war crimes, the U.S. government would be promoting not only crimes against humanity and potential war crimes, it would be promoting the impunity of Netanyahu in his corruption trial. A situation that is described in a manner that implies such an outcome would not be just, but rather the result of a deal with Jewish extremists. And that's written about in the United States Institute of Peace article by Lucy Kurtzer-Ellenbogen. Consequence number 11. Promoting the forces who want holy war, or land, for spiritual completeness. Beware that some of the Jewish extremists within Netanyahu's coalition government who advocate for Israel's expansion, like beyond the Jordan River and into the Palestinian settlements, may adhere to beliefs that such expansion is a prerequisite to the coming of the Messiah or to some sort of spiritual fulfillment. As Tom Friedman writes in his 1990 book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, Rabbi Waldman stated in an interview, quote, as long as we don't have all the land, we are not going to be complete spiritually, and total redemption will not be possible, end quote. Some Jews or Christians may also believe a holy war is a prerequisite to the second coming, as if anyone divine would want to come here on the heels of a war. While religions deserve respect, there is a limit to this respect. And magical religious beliefs regarding the supposedly divine need to engage in destructive or aggressive activities, whether killing people or conquering land or starting fires, should in no way be supported by military aid or political and social support. You don't get a pass for being cruel just because your religion tells you it's good what you're doing. It's like, oh, you can say awful things or do awful things and say, oh, it's my religion, you have to respect me. No, if you're doing cruelty, committing cruelty, you don't get a free pass. What kind of religion, what kind of religious belief is that? It's a distortion of the religion. All the great religions were distorted. Their hearts and souls were taken out of them when people start waving their religion as a flag for war. It happened when the Roman Empire became Christian. The emperor became Christian because just as he was going off to war, he saw a sign in the sky, a cross. And he thought it was a sign, like a blessing, that by the Christian symbol he's going to wage this war and win this war. And he won the war, and so he became Christian. But that was a distortion of the whole message of Christianity. You know, the distortion of the Prince of Peace, to think, oh, if you believe in this religion, you're going to win this war. Or if you win this war, it's because God loves you. I don't think any of these gods want to be mixed up with these beliefs in war, except for maybe the god of war. Consequence number 12. And this is the last one in this part 2. The creation of a landless class and preparing the cauldron for war, which is what has happened since June. Keep in mind that Israel's escalated creation of a landless class of people is exactly what began happening after the 1917 Balfour Declaration, when Jewish immigrants began displacing indigenous Arabs, largely peasants. This crowding out of Arabs, this seizing of their land through force and financial manipulations, led to immense amounts of violence, causing Britain to enlist the help of several commissions at various times to study the problem. And remember, they all found the way to solve the problem is to protect the Arabs' land. Okay, it's for 100 years they've known this. The solution to peace in the Mideast is to protect the Arabs' land. Britain's Shaw Commission of 1929 hit the nail on the head and concluded that the main source of tension was the creation of a landless class of discontented Arabs. And people are going to call this Hamas attack unprovoked? For 100 years, this landless, discontented class of Arabs has been created. And the problem has not been solved. So they found that was the main problem. Let me repeat this. The main source of tension was the creation of a landless class of discontented Arabs, as well as the common Arab fear that continued Jewish immigration would result in a Jewish-dominated Palestine. Apparently unaware of the full text of the Balfour Declaration, those Zionists, those particular Zionists, who were most vocal, condemned Britain for not supporting the Balfour Declaration, or rather, for not supporting one half of it to the exclusion of the other half. Many Jewish Zionists viewed Britain as the enemy, worse than Hitler. Unconcerned about the effects on Palestinians, their lives, livelihoods, land, and families, and this is a picture from 1948, the Palestinians walking on foot with their property over their heads, displaced, fleeing. Unconcerned about that, and unconcerned about the effect on Jewish Israelis of living amidst so much violence and hatred. The violent Zionist revisionist Vladimir Jabotinsky wanted more land for Zionists. So what happened? At the time of the Balfour Declaration in 1917, 668,258 Arabs lived in Palestine and comprised more than 85% of the population. That was in 1917. In 1946, that number had nearly doubled to 1,310,866 Arabs living in Palestine, comprising 67% of the population. Okay, so in 1946, there were 1.3 million Arabs in Palestine. By 1949, the year after Israel's creation, nearly 90% of those Arabs were gone. Only 160,000 Arabs remained. More than 1 million Arabs were gone. Because remember, there had been 1.3 million. Now there were only 160,000. More than 1 million Arabs were gone. Killed, expelled, or they fled. And remember, those Palestinian Arabs who fled or were killed or were expelled, they had nothing to do with the Holocaust. Nothing. I think it was the Saudi Arabian king who asked Roosevelt, I think it was, if you're looking for a homeland for the Jews and all these Jews were killed in Poland, why not make the homeland in Poland? There's obviously room for them. If all these Jews were killed, why not put them? He says, the Palestinian Arabs, they weren't killing the Jews. They had nothing to do with it. Why make them pay the price? Okay, I'm not saying, and don't read anything into what I'm saying, I'm just telling you history. I noticed from reading the news that so many people read into things and think people are making hints that they're not. I'm not hinting at anything other than what I'm saying. So I'm not saying, oh, Israel should be abolished. I'm just saying how unfair that was, and it's never been recognized by the U.S. government or the Israeli government. 1 million Arabs gone. If the U.S. government continues to support or continues to do nothing about the Israeli government's policies of displacing Palestinians, it will be making the same mistake that was made beginning in the 1920s and 1930s of ignoring the injustice suffered by Palestinians, people who had nothing to do with the Holocaust. And it will be helping stir the cauldron for much more violence, despair, hatred, and destruction to come. Once war has slipped out of Pandora's box, it's hard to get it back in. It was obvious in June when I wrote this of 2023 that this cauldron was being stirred. So thank you very, very much for listening to part 2. There's 4 parts to this memo that I'm reading. The next part I'll read in the next video I call Reforming Human Relations at Multiple Fronts of Conflict. Fronts of conflict amongst Palestinians and IPAC. That's what we'll be talking about. Thank you very, very much for listening and for caring. Good night.